Picture this moment, June 22nd, 1940, deep in a forest clearing at Compiègne, inside the very same railway carriage where Germany had signed its humiliating surrender just 22 years earlier, in 1918. French officials now sit across from Nazi officers, their hands trembling as they sign their nation's armistice, bringing 6 brutal weeks of fighting to a devastating end. 90,000 French soldiers have been killed, 60,000 French civilians are dead, and 10 million people, an entire population, have fled southward in what historians would later call the largest mass exodus in all of European history. France, the great nation, the proud republic, has fallen. But across the English Channel, something unexpected happens. Winston Churchill, Britain's defiant Prime Minister, stands before Parliament and announces that Britain will fight on alone, that they will never surrender, that this war is far from over. Now imagine you're a French civilian hearing this news. Your country has just collapsed after 6 weeks of horror. You've watched the roads clog with refugees, seen German tanks roll past monuments that seemed eternal, heard the screams of dive bombers, witnessed your proud army crumble like sand. You're exhausted, traumatized, trying to make sense of catastrophe. And now you hear that Britain, your former ally, refuses to accept defeat. How do you react? The answer might surprise you, because French civilians didn't respond with one voice, one emotion, one clear reaction. They responded in every possible way imaginable. And their responses reveal something profound about human nature, about hope and despair, about what happens when your world collapses and you have to decide what it all means. Let's start in Paris, now occupied by German troops, where 32-year-old Simone de Beauvoir sits in a cafe that's now frequented by German officers in their crisp uniforms. She writes in her diary about feeling something unexpected, a sort of shameful relief that the armistice has been signed, that the killing has finally stopped, that her friends are no longer dying on battlefields. But then she hears about Churchill's speech, about Britain's determination to fight on, and she writes something else entirely. The English are mad. They'll be invaded within weeks. Then what was the point of any of this? She's not alone in thinking this way. Across Paris, across the entire occupied zone, many French people share her bone-deep exhaustion, her sense that resistance is futile. They've watched their supposedly invincible army collapse in just 6 weeks, faster than anyone thought possible. They've seen the Maginot Line, that massive fortification that was supposed to protect them, simply bypassed. They've watched refugees streaming south with whatever they could carry, elderly people dying on roadsides, children separated from parents in the chaos. The idea that Britain, with its tiny army that had just been evacuated from Dunkirk minus all its heavy equipment, could somehow stand alone against the German war machine seems like pure fantasy, like dangerous delusion. A woman in Lyon, her name lost to history but her words preserved in a letter to her sister in America, writes with barely contained anger, "The British ran away at Dunkirk and left us to face the Germans alone. Now they say they'll keep fighting. Let them. We've had enough of war." This anger at Britain is real, widespread, and deeply felt across France. After all, the British Expeditionary Force had evacuated 338,000 soldiers from Dunkirk, including 123,000 French troops. But they'd left behind all their heavy equipment, all their tanks and artillery and vehicles. They'd left France to continue fighting without them, and now, from the safety of their island across the Channel, they're calling France's surrender shameful, calling it cowardice. In cafes in Marseille, in the temporary capital of Vichy, where Marshal Pétain's new government is forming, people repeat a bitter joke that captures their resentment. The British will fight to the last French soldier, but walk into different neighborhoods, talk to different people from different backgrounds and different beliefs, and you hear something completely, startlingly different. In a small fishing village in Brittany on the rugged Atlantic coast, a fisherman named Jean-Marie Cervella stands on the beach at dawn, looking across the waves toward England. He's 41 years old, too old for military service. But his 2 sons were captured during the fighting, and he has no idea if they're alive or dead. if they're prisoners or casualties, if he'll ever see them again. When he hears that Churchill has vowed to fight on, that Britain refuses to surrender, he feels something he didn't expect. Hope. He turns to his wife and says quietly, "If the English keep fighting, then this isn't over. Then maybe, just maybe, my boys will come home someday." In the unoccupied southern zone, in towns and villages across southern France where German troops haven't yet arrived, many people see Britain's defiance not as foolishness or madness, but as courage, as proof that defeat doesn't have to be accepted. A schoolteacher in Toulouse writes in her diary, "Pétain says we must accept defeat with dignity. But the English refuse to accept defeat at all. Which approach is more dignified?" These class divisions matter enormously in shaping how people react. The bourgeoisie, the property owners, the established families with wealth and social standing, they tend to support Pétain's armistice because they've seen their comfortable world turned completely upside down. And the armistice promises stability, order, security, a return to traditional values. Pétain's speeches about work, family, and fatherland resonate deeply with them. Britain's determination to keep fighting threatens to prolong the chaos, to extend the war, to make recovery impossible. But among workers, among the political left, among those who've always been suspicious of the establishment and the wealthy elite, Britain's decision to fight on sparks something entirely different. A factory worker in Saint-Étienne tells his colleagues during their lunch break, "The rich have made their peace with the Germans, found their accommodation, but the English workers are still fighting. Maybe this war isn't over after all. Maybe we don't have to accept this." The regional differences across France are equally stark and revealing. In the occupied north, where German soldiers patrol every street corner and German regulations govern every aspect of daily life, speaking openly about supporting Britain is genuinely dangerous. People keep their thoughts locked inside. They listen to BBC broadcasts in secret late at night, the radio volume turned low, curtains carefully drawn, always listening for footsteps in the hallway. When they hear the BBC's French service reporting on British determination, on RAF victories, on Churchill's defiant speeches, some feel a tiny spark of something they thought they'd lost forever. Others think the BBC is lying, that it's all propaganda, that Britain will surrender within weeks, just like France did. In the unoccupied South, the Vichy zone, there's more freedom to speak your mind. But the official government line is crystal clear. Pétain's regime blames Britain for France's defeat, claims the British abandoned France at the crucial moment. The newspapers, now controlled by Vichy, print article after article criticizing British abandonment, predicting that Germany will invade Britain within a month, suggesting that France is actually better off having made peace, having accepted reality. Many people believe this narrative completely. A merchant in Vichy itself writes to his brother, "Pétain has saved France from total destruction. The Marshal knows exactly what he's doing. The English are being stubborn and foolish. When they're invaded next month, they'll desperately wish they'd made peace like we did." But other people reading those same newspapers notice something interesting. A librarian in Clermont-Ferrand tells her husband over dinner, "The Vichy newspapers spend an awful lot of time insisting that Britain will definitely be defeated very soon. If they were really confident about that, they wouldn't need to keep saying it so often, would they?" Then comes July 3rd, 1940, and everything changes in ways no one anticipated. The British Royal Navy attacks the French fleet at Mers el-Kébir in Algeria because the British fear desperately that these French warships will fall into German hands and be used against them. The French admiral refuses to surrender his fleet or sail his ships to British-controlled ports, or even to neutral ports in the West Indies. The British, seeing no alternative, make the agonizing decision to open fire on their former allies. 1,297 French sailors die in the attack, killed by British shells, by former friends and allies. The news explodes across France like a bomb. In Paris, in Lyon, in Marseille, in villages across both zones, French civilians react with shock, horror, and absolute fury. Even those who'd sympathized with Britain's decision to fight on, even those who'd secretly admired Churchill's defiance, feel utterly betrayed. The British have killed French sailors, murdered French boys. Former allies have become killers, have committed what feels like an unforgivable crime. A woman in Bordeaux, whose cousin died at Mers el-Kébir, writes in her diary with shaking hands, "I wanted so badly to believe the English were still our friends, that they would liberate us someday, that their fight meant something for us. Now I know they're just as much our enemy as the Germans are. They've murdered our boys in cold blood." Vichy propaganda seizes this moment with both hands. Posters go up across the country showing British warships firing on defenseless French sailors. Newspapers run enormous headlines about British treachery, British barbarism, British willingness to murder former allies. Pétain himself denounces what he calls Britain's hateful aggression in a radio address that millions hear. For weeks and weeks, French public opinion swings sharply, dramatically against Britain. Even secret resistors, even those who despise Vichy and everything it stands for, struggle with what Britain has done. A young man in Paris who will later join the resistance writes years afterward in his memoirs, "Mers el-Kébir made me hate the English for months afterward. I understood intellectually why they did it, understood the strategic logic, but understanding didn't stop the hate, didn't make it hurt any less." But here's what's truly remarkable about this story, what reveals something profound about human resilience and changing perspectives. The hate doesn't last forever for everyone. As summer slowly turns to fall, as the Battle of Britain rages in the skies over southern England, something fundamental begins to shift in how some French people see the situation. German bombers cross the English Channel every single day, wave after wave of aircraft. The Luftwaffe is supposed to crush Britain in a matter of weeks, destroy the RAF, clear the way for invasion. Vichy newspapers confidently predict British surrender any day now. German newsreels shown in French cinemas display burning British cities, destroyed buildings, crying civilians. Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion of Britain, is supposedly coming any moment. But Britain doesn't surrender. The RAF fights back with unexpected ferocity and skill. German losses mount steadily. Weeks pass, then an entire month, then 2 months, and Britain is still there, still fighting, still impossibly defiant. French civilians begin to notice this stubborn fact. In occupied Paris, a baker named Henri Dubois listens to the BBC on a radio hidden behind flour sacks in his basement. He hears reports of RAF victories, of German bombers shot down in flames, of British determination holding firm. He doesn't know whether these reports are true or just propaganda, whether the British are lying about their successes to maintain morale, but he notices something else. The German soldiers who come into his shop seem worried now, seem less confident than they were in June. The invasion that was definitely supposed to happen in August, then definitely in September, somehow never comes. Maybe, he tells his wife late at night, speaking in careful whispers in their bedroom, maybe the English aren't as finished as everyone thought they were. In the southern zone, a farmer goes to the cinema in his local town and watches German newsreels that show British cities burning, show destruction and chaos. But they also show something the German editors probably didn't intend. They show British people refusing to give up, refusing to break, maintaining their daily lives amid the bombing. They show Churchill giving speeches, his jaw set, his defiance absolute. The farmer, who genuinely thought Britain's decision to fight on was suicidal stupidity, pure madness, begins to wonder whether he'd gotten something fundamentally wrong. By winter of 1940 into 1941, French public opinion is shifting once again. Not everywhere, not for everyone, not uniformly, but in certain circles, in certain hearts, in certain communities. Britain's survival against all odds is changing people's calculations about what's possible, about whether defeat has to be permanent. A young woman in Lyon named Lucie Aubrac, who will become one of France's most famous resistance leaders, writes decades later about this crucial period. When Britain didn't fall, when they survived the bombing, when they kept fighting month after month after everyone said they'd collapse, it changed something deep inside us. It made resistance seem possible again. If they could stand completely alone against Germany and survive, maybe we didn't have to passively accept defeat either. Maybe there was another way. The class divisions that shaped initial reactions persist, but begin to evolve in interesting ways. The bourgeoisie, who'd enthusiastically supported Vichy and Pétain's armistice, start to hedge their bets carefully. Maybe Britain will actually survive this. Maybe Germany won't win after all. Better to be very careful about what you say publicly, just in case the situation changes. A businessman in Toulouse who'd loudly praised Pétain's wisdom in making peace with Germany starts quietly telling people he'd always secretly thought Britain would somehow hold out, would somehow survive. Among workers, among the political left, among those who'd never trusted Pétain or his traditional values, Britain's survival actively fuels growing resistance movements. Communist workers in Paris, despite the Nazi-Soviet pact that's technically still in effect, see Britain's fight as living proof that fascism can be opposed, can be resisted, can be fought. Socialist workers in Marseille start organizing in secret. Britain's example, Britain's stubborn refusal to quit, gives them courage they didn't know they still had. But the regional divide between North and South deepens significantly as time passes. In the occupied North, German control becomes increasingly total, increasingly oppressive. Supporting Britain, even privately in your own home, becomes genuinely dangerous. The Gestapo and their French collaborationist police arrest anyone suspected of listening to the BBC, of spreading Gaullist propaganda, of expressing even the smallest hope for British victory. A woman in Lille is arrested simply for saying in a shop that she hopes Britain wins the war. She spends 6 terrible months in prison for those few words. In the unoccupied South, there's still more space to think freely, to talk carefully with trusted friends, to quietly hope. The Vichy government officially still opposes Britain, still predicts German victory, but they can't control every single conversation, every private thought. In homes late at night, in careful moments between friends, people discuss what Britain's unexpected survival might actually mean for France's future. A teacher in Montpellier asks his students to write essays about the war as a classroom assignment. One student, just 14 years old, writes something remarkable. Marshal Pétain says we must accept our defeat with dignity and build a new France. But the English show us that defeat can be refused, that you can say no. I don't know who is right about this, but I know which approach makes me feel less ashamed of being French right now. The teacher keeps this essay hidden in his desk drawer. He doesn't turn it in to the authorities like he's probably supposed to. He's starting to think this boy might be onto something important. By 1941, by 1942, as Britain not only survives but actually starts to fight back, as the war expands dramatically to Russia, when Germany invades the Soviet Union, and then to the Pacific, when America enters after Pearl Harbor, French civilian opinion continues its complex, fascinating evolution. Those who'd initially seen Britain's decision to fight on as foolish stubbornness, as irrational madness, now begin to see it as strategic wisdom, as the only choice that made sense. Those who'd been angry at British abandonment at Dunkirk now desperately hope for British liberation, for British and Allied armies to return to France. Those who'd supported Vichy's collaboration with Germany now quietly try to distance themselves from that position, try to position themselves more carefully for whatever comes next. But human nature being what it is, it's never simple, never clean, never a straightforward narrative. A woman in Paris whose brother died at Mers el-Kébir never forgives Britain, not even after liberation, not even after the war ends. The wound is too deep, too personal. A man in Bordeaux who'd praised British courage back in 1940 becomes an active collaborator in 1942, decides that Germany will definitely win after all, and he'd better be on the winning side. A family in Normandy splits apart over these questions. The father supporting Vichy and Pétain's vision, the two sons secretly joining the resistance inspired by British example, the daughter marrying a German officer because she's fallen in love, or because it offers protection, or for reasons even she might not fully understand. This incredible diversity of French opinion, this profound complexity of French responses to Britain's decision, reveals something important about defeat and hope, about human nature and survival. When France surrendered and Britain fought on alone, French civilians didn't react as one unified nation, didn't respond with one clear voice. They reacted as millions of separate individuals, each person with their own fears, their own hopes, their own calculations about survival and dignity, and what the future might possibly hold. Some saw British defiance as noble and inspiring. Some saw it as foolish and dangerous. Some saw it as both noble and foolish at the same time. Some changed their minds completely as events unfolded. Some never changed their opinion at all. A man in Toulouse who'd been captured during the fighting and then released, writes to his sister in 1943, "When we surrendered and the English kept fighting, I honestly thought they were complete idiots. I thought they'd be invaded within weeks and we'd all end up under German rule anyway, so what was the point of more death, more suffering? But they weren't invaded. They kept fighting through everything. And now I'm in the resistance myself. The English were right all along. Some things really are worth fighting for even when you think you've already lost." But his sister writes back with a different perspective. That's equally valid. "You say the English were right to keep fighting, but how many more French people have died because they prolonged this war? How many more cities have been bombed? How many more families destroyed? Maybe if everyone had made peace back in 1940 like we did, we'd all still be alive and whole, and our cities wouldn't be ruins. Maybe the English just prolonged everyone's suffering for their own pride." Both letters survive today in archives, carefully preserved. Both perspectives are completely real, completely sincere. Neither is complete without understanding the other. The story of what French civilians actually said and thought and felt when Britain fought on while France surrendered isn't a story of one single reaction, one clear response. It's a story of millions of different reactions changing over time, shaped by social class and geographic region and political beliefs, and personal experience and hope and fear and anger and admiration all mixed together in impossible tangles. In the occupied North, one woman hides a British pilot who's been shot down over France, risks her life and her family's lives to help him escape back to England. When someone asks her years later why she did something so incredibly dangerous, she says simply, "Because when we gave up, they didn't. Someone had to remember that fighting back was still possible, that resistance was still an option." But in that same city, just a few streets away, another woman reports her neighbor to the authorities for listening to BBC broadcasts. She genuinely believes in Pétain's vision of a new France at peace with Germany, believes the British are unnecessarily prolonging the war. She's not a monster, not evil. She's just a woman trying to survive, trying to do what she thinks is right, believing the authorities who tell her that collaboration is the path to peace and stability. In the southern zone, a mayor of a small village courageously refuses to implement Vichy's anti-Jewish laws, even though he could be arrested. When someone asks him why he's taking this risk, he explains, "The English are still fighting over there. That means this war isn't over yet. That means we don't have to obey these evil orders. We can choose differently." He saved 17 Jewish families through his quiet resistance. But in the very next village over, another mayor enthusiastically implements those same anti-Jewish laws, denounces Jewish families to authorities, helps round them up. He genuinely believes Vichy represents France's future, that Pétain knows best. He thinks Britain's continued fighting is purely a British problem, not a French one. He sees absolutely no connection between British defiance and his own moral choices. By 1944, as Allied forces prepare to invade, as the resistance grows dramatically stronger, as Vichy's authority crumbles day by day, French public opinion has shifted dramatically from where it was in June 1940. Most French civilians now desperately hope for Allied liberation, now see Britain's decision to fight on as having been absolutely correct, as having been the right choice. But this widespread view is hindsight, is the comfortable perspective from victory, from knowing how everything turned out, back in June 1940, standing in the ruins of defeat. watching their country surrender while their ally defiantly fought on. French civilians had absolutely no way to know how it would all end. They had to make sense of this impossible situation with only the information they had at that moment, with their fears and hopes and exhaustion and anger and everything else that makes us human, makes us struggle with impossible choices. Some French civilians saw British defiance and felt abandoned, felt betrayed. Some saw it and felt hope rekindled. Some felt both emotions at once, torn between resentment and admiration. Some changed their minds as circumstances changed. Some never did change their views. All of them were French citizens. All of them were trying to survive an impossible situation. All of them were responding to catastrophe with whatever emotional and intellectual resources they had available. An old woman in Provence, interviewed in 1945, right after liberation, is asked what she thought back in June 1940, when Britain fought on while France surrendered. She thinks carefully before answering. "I thought they were completely crazy, honestly. I thought they'd be destroyed within weeks. I thought we'd all be destroyed and it would all be for nothing. But I also thought, somewhere deep down in a place I barely admitted to myself, that maybe crazy was exactly what that moment required from someone. Maybe sanity had become surrender and madness had become hope. And maybe, just maybe, we all needed more madness, needed someone to be unreasonable." She pauses, looking directly at the interviewer, then adds, "I was right, it turns out. We needed the madness desperately. We needed someone to refuse the logic of defeat, to say no when everyone said resistance was impossible. Even if it was the English doing it, even if they'd left us at Dunkirk, even if they'd killed our sailors at Mers el-Kebir, we needed someone to show us that refusing defeat was still possible, that no was still an option." But then she adds one more crucial thing, speaking quietly. "Though I absolutely didn't know any of that back in June 1940. Back then, I just thought they were crazy and we were all doomed." That uncertainty, that fundamental not knowing, that experience of living through history without any idea how it would end, that was the actual reality for French civilians in that summer of 1940. They didn't know Britain would miraculously survive. They didn't know America would eventually join the war and tip the balance. They didn't know they'd be liberated, that France would be free again. They only knew one simple, terrifying fact. Their country had surrendered, and their former ally hadn't, and they had to decide for themselves what that meant, what it said about courage and wisdom and survival and hope. Their answers varied enormously because they were human beings, not characters in a story. Because human beings are endlessly complex, because defeat and hope and fear and courage don't follow simple, predictable patterns, don't fit into neat categories. Some French civilians genuinely praised British determination and saw it as heroic. Some bitterly cursed it and saw it as foolish pride. Some did both at different times. Some changed their entire worldview as events unfolded. Some held the same view from beginning to end regardless of what happened. What they said when Britain fought on while France surrendered was everything all at once. It was anger and admiration mixed together. It was despair and hope fighting for space in the same heart. It was feelings of betrayal and inspiration existing side by side. It was all of these contradictory emotions at the same time. Millions of voices responding to an impossible moment in millions of different ways. And that complexity, that stubborn refusal to fit into any simple narrative, that's exactly what makes their responses so deeply human, so genuinely real, so absolutely worth remembering and understanding today. They weren't just characters in a history book with clear heroes and villains, with obvious right and wrong answers. They were real people trying to survive, trying desperately to make sense of catastrophe, trying to decide what to believe when the entire world had collapsed around them and nothing made sense anymore. Some of them got it right and saw clearly what was happening. Some of them got it wrong and believed things that weren't true. Most of them got it partly right and partly wrong. had some insights and some blind spots, just like the rest of us would have done in their impossible situation, just like we all do now when we face our own impossible moments and have to decide whether to surrender or fight on, whether to embrace hope or accept despair, whether to see defiance as courage or dismiss it as madness. The French civilians of 1940 didn't know they were making history, didn't know future generations would study their choices and reactions. They were just trying to live through history, trying to survive day by day. What they said, what they thought, what they felt in those terrible months, it was all real, all completely valid, all part of the vast and complicated truth of what it actually means to watch your world fall apart and have to decide what comes next. What to believe, how to survive, whether to hope